we are recording.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Paul, you can start.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Sorry for the short delay. We actually connected earlier to fix the technical problems, but we had more than we expected.
Yes.
And finally, we had to help Professor Lem connect with my account. So that's why you are seeing on the screen my younger version and my wiser version. It says there. Okay, so good evening again. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone to our seminar. I'm glad to see many people joining in. It means there's a lot of interest in the topic in general and in what Professor Lem has to say about it. Also, I would like to say that it is a great honor for me to introduce Professor Lem because although he might not know it yet, I consider him to be one of my mentors. Sidney Lamb is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics and Cognitive Science at Rice University, Houston, Texas, and the creator of relational network theory, also known as neurocognitive linguistics, a significant alternative theory to Chomsky's transformational grammar. Professor Lamb obtained his PhD in 1958 from the University of California, Berkeley, and he taught at the same institution from 1956 to 1964, directing the machine translation project from 1958 to 1964. He moved to Yale University in 1964 and taught there until 1977, when he left for a high-tech venture back in Berkeley. After selling it to a large electric company in 1980, he was appointed Professor of Linguistics and Semiotics at Rice University in Houston, where he became Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Linguistics in 1983 and Professor of Cognitive Sciences in 1996. He was named Professor Emeritus at Rice in 1998. Professor Lamb's work has focused on several topics ranging from North American Indian languages to computational linguistics and machine translation, and most importantly, the underlying neurocognitive mechanisms of language. An early version of his view on the linguistic system was presented under the title Outline of Stratificational Grammar in 1966. The theory was later considerably developed by exploring its relationships to neurological structures and to thinking processes. These later developments were incorporated in his 1999 book, Pathways of the Brain, the Neurocognitive Basis of Language. An updated and abridged version was published with the title Linguistic Structure Plausible Theory in Language Under Discussion, Volume 4, which is also available online. His model is based on the idea that the linguistic system, along with the general cognitive system, is purely relational and that linguistic processing is a matter of selective activation along pathways in interconnected subnetworks of the overall cognitive network. It is this very model that drew my attention a few years ago. I was trying to figure out what was going on in the mind of bilingual speakers when they mix languages. And I was frustrated that most linguistic theories were not concerned with this mental aspect of language. When I read Pathways of the Brain, it gave me hope that someday we might be able to understand those complex cognitive processes. So now I spend my time trying to apply this theory to my area of research, which is linguistic contact between Spanish and Romanian. I also met Professor Lamb 3 years ago when I spent the spring semester at Rice University as a Fulbright visiting scholar. And although it was the crazy COVID pandemic period, we managed to meet several times and discuss about my project. I would like to thank him again for the time and the advice he offered back then, and also for thank him for agreeing to be with us today. In this presentation, Professor Lamb will offer an introduction to his relational network theory and its aims, along with some findings of interest to cognitive science in general. Professor Lamb?
You're ready, yes. Okay, hello everybody. I'm very glad to be able to visit Bucharest without actually leaving my home here in Houston, Texas. First time I've ever been in Bucharest. I'm going to begin with a question that I asked my daughter Sarah. She was 5 years old at the time. She's now a grown woman, and she's a professor of anthropology at a university in the Boston area. But when she was 5 years old, she was learning to play the piano. I asked her, Sarah, when you decide to hit a key on the piano, how does your brain tell your finger what to do? Sarah said, well, my brain writes a little note and sends it down to my finger, and the finger reads it and knows what to do. Well, of course, this theory has problems. The brain does not have any paper or pencil or any other writing devices. And if it did, what language would it write this note in? And the hand does not have any little eyes or other reading devices. And so, so we know what really happens is that the brain has neural connections, nerve fibers, and activation goes from the brain along the fiber down to the hand and activates the muscles in the hand. It's actually a complex process, and it takes many nerve fibers and many nervous impulses, but that's what it happens. There are no little symbols or notes or anything like that. So the same thinking applies to language. How does your brain tell your mouth what to say when you want to say something? The brain doesn't contain any devices for reading or writing. It does not use symbols at all. It can't. How would it write them? How would it read them? What language would they be written in? No, the brain is a network. It operates by sending activation along neural fibers. So the brain sends activation along neural fibers to the muscles in your mouth and lungs, and that's how it allows you to speak. So we can be realistic about language. We don't have to believe that the linguistic system contains symbols. It does not. We can have a linguistics that is relatable to other fields of science. In order to do that, we have to recognize that a linguistic system is a network, and it is a network that operates. This is a very important thing because most linguistic theories, from the beginning of linguistic theory, have not had any way of explaining how it is possible for people to speak. The linguistic system actually operates. We know that because we can see people speaking. So the linguistic system enables people to speak and to understand the speech of others and to learn how to speak and understand. So these are the topics I'm going to cover briefly today. Start with some basic principles. What counts in linguistic structure, since it's not using symbols, what counts is not what, but where. What would be things like symbolic representations, letters and binary digits, or other symbolic representations that are used by humans, or information that is external to the brain. That's also the way computers operate. People sometimes call a computer an electronic brain. That's a mistake. Computers do not operate the way a brain operates. So what counts is where, that is, where, and we'll see how that works. We can call it a connectionist representation. The information is in the connectivity. Location matters. It is of the utmost importance. So some properties of connectionist representation. The information is in the connectivity, and it is distributed. And yet, as we shall see, every node has a specific local function. You get access to the information without searching by following connections. Now, we have to distinguish between low-level information and higher-level information. We'll see more about that later. Low-level information is in dedicated locations built into the brain structure. Higher-level information, we can say it is opportunistic. It's located in accordance with the experience of a person through one's life. So now we go to a little neural. The major parts of the brain are these things, medulla, pons, cerebellum, midbrain, thalamus, hypothalamus. These are all very important subcortical structures. And then when you see pictures of the brain, what you usually see is just this top part, the cerebral hemispheres. That consists of the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, basal forebrain nuclei, and amygdaloid nucleus. The cerebral cortex is the part that we're interested in. So you can see it's just one part of the brain. That's where language is. We know that now. So here's a picture of the cerebral cortex. Two hemispheres, as you can see here, separated by this interhemispheric fissure. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, if you cut away part of the right hemisphere, you can see there are millions of these fibers. This is called the corpus callosum. They provide connections from the one hemisphere to the other. The major landmarks of the left hemisphere are the central sulcus and the sylvian fissure. And they divide the brain, this is not the brain, but just the cerebral cortex, into these lobes. In front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe here, parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe in the back. Those are the four lobes in each hemisphere. This is the left hemisphere showing. This structure here is the cerebellum. It's not part of the cerebral cortex. Now, these primary areas are built in. The primary motor area goes along the front side of the central sulcus, primary somatosensory area along the just posterior to that. And it's laid out in different sections according to parts of the body. Then we have the primary auditory area in the temporal lobe, primary visual area right in the back in the occipital lobe. So these are our primary areas. And as I said, both on both sides, this is the central sulcus. You can see here. The anterior part is connected to muscles, which allow the body to make movements in the mouth. This is used for speech, hand, fingers, and so on. And just to the posterior is where the feeling takes place, sensations. So in order to speak, you not only have to be able to move the muscles of your mouth, you have to know what they are doing and where they are. And that's over in this part. So knowing where things are is just on this side, and doing it is on this side. So the higher level motor areas are above, more anterior. So actions performed by the mouth. These are the elementary movements of things like the tongue, and the more complex ones are anterior to that. Complex operations using the hand over here and so on. So this is the area that is extremely important for speaking. It's called Broca's area, B-R-O-C-A. Now these facts are all well established. The brain is a network composed of neurons. They are, of course, interconnected by means of axons and dendrites. The axons are for output from a neuron. Dendrites receive input from other neurons. Activity, which is essentially electrical activity, travels along the neural pathways. The cortical neurons are clustered in columns. We'll see more about this in a few minutes. Each column acts as a unit, so that if you look at the cortex functionally, the units which are important are the columns, not the individual neurons. Now, the locations of various kinds of information are pretty well established in neuroscience. For example, the visual, auditory, and so on. Now, from the known facts, we can make several deductions. Everything represented in the brain has the form of a network. The whole brain is a network. We can call it the human information system or the personal mental cosmos. Therefore, a person's linguistic and conceptual system is a network because it's part of the information system. So every lexical entry, every concept is a subnetwork. We can call that a functional web, if we want a term for it. So next topic is on bottom-up learning. This is a little introduction to the learning process. The basic principle is that links get stronger when they are successfully used. This is called Hebbian learning because it was first proposed as a hypothesis by Donald Hebb, a psychologist, way back in 1948, and it has turned out to be correct. Hebb himself didn't lay out the details of how it works, but it was an extremely important intuition. Initially, the connection strengths, these are strengths because of the nerve fibers, the axons, mainly. They're very weak, and learning consists of strengthening them. You get strengthened until they reach the threshold of the neurons, which constitute nodes, as we shall see in a few minutes. They get adjusted. Now, in order to make learning possible, the way the brain does it, it's necessary to have an abundance of latent connections. That is, connections that are not established. They're available to be established, along with abundance of latent nodes. So learning is a bottom-up process. The consequence of this, and we shall see more about this too, is that structure in the brain after it gets established is hierarchical. And the way it works is the way everything works in biology. You try thousands of possibilities, and only a few of them will succeed, and they get strengthened. This is seen throughout biology, and I'll show you some examples in a few minutes. This requires the abundance hypothesis. You have to have abundant latent neurons and abundant latent connections. Every neuron has thousands of connections to other neurons, but most of them are latent, by far most of them. So electrical activity sent from a cell body to its axon. That's the way the communication works. It's electrical activity along the axon. It travels along thousands of axon branches. Every neuron has thousands of branches, even though only one or a few of them may lead to downstream activation. A neuroscientist named Edelman calls this silent synapses. Most of the synapse is a junction from one neuron to the next. Most of them are silent, by far most. This can be compared to the acorns falling from an oak tree. Thousands of acorns fall from a single oak tree, but only a very few, maybe only one or two, will lead to an actual new oak tree. A sea tortoise lays thousands of eggs, but only a few of them survive to become new turtles of the next generation. So here's a look at the basic process. Let's assume that these are nodes here that represent knowledge already, whatever it is, a feature maybe. And you get latent links and latent nodes. Okay. So let's suppose that these nodes get activated. Then they will transmit activation along their output lines up to the next level. Only this one gets enough activation because it's getting it from two places to cross its threshold. So its threshold is satisfied, it gets enough activation. For these others, the threshold is not satisfied. So now, as this is the Hebbian learning process, because these activations from these two were successful, they get strengthened and the node's threshold gets raised. Now, this newly dedicated node is dedicated specifically to function AB, whatever functions A and B have. This is the combination of those two. So it has a specific function from now on, AB, whatever that is. And then the next time it gets activated, it will send transmission. It will transmit activation along these links to the next level. So as we see from that example, an abstract example, of course, learning has to be bottom up. You have to have the lower level components before you can build more complex structures from them. This theory is supported by what is known from neuroscience about the progress of myelination. Now, myelination is the name for the property that every axon, well, not every axon, but most axons in the cortex have myelin sheaths. Myelin is a substance that provides insulation for the nerve fibers, and it also greatly enhances the transmission of the nerve impulse. That myelin is built into the brain mostly after birth, and it starts out from the primary areas and spreads. And so that supports bottom-up learning. Now, additional operations. Links get stronger when they are successfully used. So initially, as we have seen, all connection strengths are very, very weak. Learning consists of strengthening them. So learning doesn't consist of building new connections, it consists of strengthening connections. And after something like AB, whatever that abstract example was, is initially learned, those connections get further reinforced by additional successful use. And every time that happens, the threshold is adjusted so the node doesn't get too easily satisfied in the future. Now, all of this requires the abundance hypothesis. That is, there have to be abundant latent connections and latent nodes available throughout the brain. And there are. I mean, we have in the average cortex 26 billion neurons, enough to last a lifetime. So here's a review of the major processes. It's a bottom-up process. It works by trial and error. That is, every time a neuron gets activated, it tries thousands of possibilities. That is, it sends activation out to thousands of axonal fibers. And only those few that succeed get strengthened. The abundance hypothesis, you have to have abundant latent neurons and abundant connections. Now, this leads to functional specificity. The nodes in the network each have a specific function. For primary areas, this is an established finding, and the best source on this is by Vernon Mountcastle, Perceptual Neuroscience. So, examples. Points on the fingers. Every point on the finger is represented by a specific neuron in the cortex, actually a specific column of neurons. We'll talk about columns in a few minutes. Same thing for visual features and auditory features. They are pretty much built into brain structure, that each location has a specific function. Now, the same principle applies at higher levels. A concept is represented as a hierarchical web. It's a hierarchy, and follows from bottom-up learning. So most high-level things like concepts are represented by networks comprising thousands of nodes. And each node among those thousands has a specific function, including the cardinal node at the very top, which represents, for example, a concept. This is a consequence of the learning process. It automatically follows from the bottom-up properties of learning. So a concept is spread over a wide area of cortex, which includes a lot of perceptual and conceptual information. So cortical hierarchy, the meanings of words and syntactic instructions are represented in the mental network as concepts and percepts. Meanings are part of language. You can't understand language without understanding the meanings of words, but they're also part of the general human information system. So they are within the same network system as the rest of the linguistic structure. You can't find a boundary between language and concepts. So a person's model of the cosmos, or to put it more gently, a model of the world, is inseparable from the person's knowledge of his language. So how do we distinguish percepts and concepts? A percept is something involving one sensory modality, and it happens that the locations are generally known. Auditory percepts are in the temporal lobe, visual in the occipital lobe, somatosensory in the parietal lobe. The concept is something with more than one sensory modality. They are at a higher level than percepts, and we know the locations for them too. Well, most of that is really hypothesis still. So let's take an example. Consider the dog. We know what a dog looks like. That's visual information. We know what its bark sounds like. That's auditory information. We know what its fur feels like. Somatosensory information. All of these are perceptual information. They all require subwebs with many nodes each. For example, what a dog looks like is a large network with variations for different kinds of dogs. So they constitute subwebs with many nodes each. They are interconnected into a larger web representing the concept of a dog, along with further conceptual information, such as the fact that dogs are mammals. So let's construct a model of a web. So these are cardinal nodes for different kinds of things. This is V for vision, and if we zoom in on that, we see that it is a network consisting of many layers, many features, only a few of which are shown here, perhaps thousands of nodes. That's all under this V node. That's the cardinal node for the visual image. And similarly, here we have a phonological image, what a dog's bark sounds like. T, what a dog's fur feels like. M, now if we use fork now as an example instead of dog, M would be the motor activity associated with a fork. What you do to pick up a fork with your hand and put it into your mouth and things like that. So each of these is a cardinal node supported by a large subweb. So P stands for the phonological image of the spoken form. Yeah, we know the location of that, Wernicke's area, it's called. PA is the primary auditory, that is what the ears receive as processed by the midbrain. And then if we add a node here for phonological production, that's up in the front part of the brain, and this is connected to the muscles that activate the speech apparatus that allows you to say the word fork. So I have laid these nodes in these positions, these cardinal nodes, because we know a fair amount about their locations. Let's look at it this way. So this is the functional web for fork showing cardinal nodes only. Each one of these is supported by a large subweb, and the whole structure is hierarchical. Okay. So here's an activated one. That red indicates activation. So let's say you hear or you see a fork. It activates the visual features, that activates the node here, and so on. Well, we're going to show you an animation of this. This is seeing a fork, that is, you're getting the visual input. And so the activation spreads through the network. Over here, then if you want to say what you saw, fork, these nodes go to structures which lead to the muscles that control the organs of articulation. That whole process that you just saw takes about 0.6 of a second. We know this from the results of an experiment that was done a few years ago at the University of Helsinki using magnetic resonance imaging. In this experiment, the subject was shown a picture of an animal, and they were asked to say, what animal, as fast as possible. So it was a horse, they say horse. And the average time for this process was 600 milliseconds. That's 0.6 of a second. It seems to the person, either the person doing it or the person observing, that it's happening instantaneously. But that instantaneous process is not really instantaneous at all. It takes about 0.6 of a second. And what was happening during that period of time was those operations that you saw going through the network. So we have a basic principle, nodal specificity, we can call it. Every node has a specific function. For the lower levels, this is an established finding, supported by many experiments that are reported on in this book by Mountcastle. For higher levels, it's an automatic consequence of the learning process. Now we come into the nodes and links, these cortical columns. Nodes of the network, as we have talked about it so far, are implemented as cortical columns. That is, columns in the cortex. Columns consists of nodes, of neurons. They have been defined and explained, elaborated on by Mountcastle. The interconnections between the columns are represented by neural connections. You get axonal fibers and dendritic fibers. So the properties of columns and functional webs can be derived from Mountcastle's treatment, together with findings from neurolinguistics. Mountcastle says, the effective unit of operation in the cortex is not the single neuron and its axon, but bundles or groups of cells and their axons with similar functional properties and anatomical connections. Now we get a little view of this by looking at some microscopic views of cortical structure. Different kinds of stains show different features and hide other features. This Weigert stain shows the structure, the layers of the cortex. There's the bottom of the cortex, the top of the cortex. The total is about 4 5 millimeters. And you get different things. This level here, you can see all these horizontal fibers that aren't shown in the other ones. This Nisley stain shows the cell bodies of so-called pyramidal neurons. And if you look closely, you can see they're kind of arranged on top of one another. And they actually are. This one doesn't show the fibers, but if it did, you would see that from each of these neurons, there is an axon heading downwards, and it goes all the way down to the bottom into the white matter. And there are also fibers coming up from other parts of the cortex going up, and they actually go up to the top level here, where they branch very broadly, connecting with thousands of other neurons up here. This is a schematic of the layers of the cortex. At the bottom is the white matter. The white matter consists entirely of the axons of pyramidal neurons. This is an example of a pyramidal neuron. The gray matter consists entirely of columns of neurons. This is very important. The white matter is the intercolumn connections implemented as the axons of neurons. Sorry, that should say beneath the gray matter. This is white matter, it's beneath. Okay. So this is just to remind you, we have the property of nodal specificity. Every node has a specific function. And by the way, every node we now see is represented as a column of neurons. For the higher levels, it's a consequence of the learning process. So the columns come in different sizes. The smallest one is the mini column. The width is about the diameter of a single pyramidal cell at 30 to 50 microns. Now, this is very important. The column extends throughout the 6 cortical layers. And therefore, the entire thickness of the cortex is accounted for by the columns. You don't see that when you see those pictures of the brain. The columns are roughly cylindrical in shape. If expanded by a factor of 100, then it would correspond to a tube with a diameter of 1/8 of an inch, a length of 1 foot, a very long, narrow tube. Okay, so these mini columns, 30 to 50 microns in diameter. Axon collaterals are the axon. There's not just one axon, but there are branches. Some of them stay within the column, and they go up and down in the column to activate other neurons in the same column. The importance of this is that as soon as a neuron that is a pyramidal neuron, within the column gets activated, it activates all the other neurons in the same column. So the whole column gets activated together. There are also inhibitory neurons, which inhibit neurons of neighboring columns. That provides contrast. And there are also excitatory neurons that can activate neighboring columns. And that allows you to get larger columns. So let's look at a few quantities. The mini column is about 30 microns in diameter. So neurons per mini column, about average 75 to 80. So in 1 square millimeter of cortical surface, you get about over 1,000 mini columns. 1 square centimeter, 146,000. The number of neurons. This is the number of columns, number of neurons. So this allows us to estimate the number of mini columns in Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is very important because that's where speech recognition takes place. It's in the temporal lobe. So there are almost 3 million mini columns. And that's That's enough to account for everything you need for phonological recognition. So this leads to our next finding. In each hemisphere, the cortex looks like a three-dimensional structure. It certainly does when you see pictures of it. It's actually very thin and very broad. It's crumpled so that it will fit inside the skull. It's actually like a thick napkin. The area, each hemisphere, is about 1,300 square centimeters. The thickness varies from 3 to 5 millimeters. It's subdivided into 6 layers. So it's really a very broad, like a napkin, and thin. It's only a few millimeters thick. This is how you understand its basic structure. Never mind that crumpling. That was just to get it to fit inside the skull. And therefore, the thickness of the cortex is entirely accounted for by the columns. Therefore, the cortex is an array. That means a two-dimensional structure. This is very much easier to comprehend than a three-dimensional structure would be. Three-dimensional structure would give you much greater complexity. So from this point of view, the cortex is actually quite a simple structure. The third dimension is for the internal structure of the nodes, that's the columns, and the connections from one part of the cortex to another. That's white matter, and that consists of axons of pyramidal neurons. So nodes are connected to both nearby nodes and distant nodes. The nearby nodes are short axon fibers going horizontally to neighboring columns. And then you get the long axon fibers. These are the ones in the white matter. They can go to several centimeters away or to the opposite hemisphere. Connections to nearby nodes are either excitatory or inhibitory, but the connections to distant nodes are excitatory only. And as I said, those in the white matter. So here's a schematic. Here's a column. You get these short connections horizontally. They can be either inhibitory or excitatory. The long distance ones are excitatory only. So here's a simplified model of a mini column. It's showing only a few. There are these are pyramidal neuron bodies, cell bodies. There are usually up to 100 of these within a column. I'm only showing 2 of them, and to show for certain important features. They have connections to other neurons within the same column and connections subcortical, that is, through the white matter to other neurons, other columns that may be quite distant. So when a column gets activated, it can maintain its activation for a while, by this means, until it gets turned off by this. This is a schematic of the node that turns off activation. Now, inhibitory neurons can also go and inhibit competing neurons. And by the way this architecture works, neighboring columns are likely to be in competition because they're likely to represent similar things, whether they be concepts or percepts or whatever. Okay, so the column is the fundamental module of perceptual systems and probably also of motor systems. It has been found in all of the animals that have been investigated. There are numerous experiments performed that are described in Mountcastle's book. The theory is confirmed by detailed studies of visual, auditory, and somatosensory perception in living cat and monkey brains. So more on nodal specificity. Every node in a functional web has a specific function. The nodes constitute a subweb. Their function fits the portion of cortex in which they are located. For example, phonological recognition in Wernicke's area, in the temporal lobe, visual in the occipital and lower temporal. We don't have to worry about these details. Each node of a subweb also has a specific function within that of the subweb. So how do they determine all that? Here's an example from a study that's using a cat's paw. And this is a portion of the cortex. And they insert a microelectrode into the cat's cortex. These are individual pyramidal cells in a column. And this shows that every one of them responds to the same location when this part of the cat's paw is stimulated. There's a specific location on the cat's paw leads to activation in a specific location of the cortex. Okay. Here's another example from the visual cortex. This is the left and right visual fields, but this is the important part here. This is from Mountcastle's book. The adjacent columns represent short line segments of slightly varying orientation. This is the microelectrode presentation. With all the columns with all the nodes in a specific column, you get the same orientation of the line. Adjacency, another problem. Nodes of related function are in adjacent locations. The more closely related, the more closely adjacent. This is a beautiful thing to understand about the way the brain works. For example, adjacent locations on a cat's paw are represented by adjacent locations in the cortex. Lines of similar orientation are represented by adjacent cortical locations, as we saw in that. So, for example, this is the one I just looked at there. Here's an adjacent column. If that electrode, these are very tiny electrodes, if it slips over to the next column along the way, it picks up activation from the neighboring spot on the cat's paw. Now we can extrapolate these findings to human beings. The experiments were done on monkeys and cats, but we can hypothesize that these functions about cortical structure can be extrapolated to human cortical structure. This is widely assumed to be valid by neuroscience. Why? We know from a neuroanatomy that locally cortical structure is a relatively uniform across mammals. And cortical function is also relatively uniform. So we have seen a functional web is hierarchically organized. The higher levels are in more or less known locations. The executive areas are in the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is especially much larger in humans than in other animals. Every subweb of a large web is also hierarchically organized. And therefore you have cardinal nodes, the cardinal nodes at the top of the entire web. So for example, we can say that at the top of the web for cat, there is a cardinal node, cat. Each subweb also has a cardinal node at the top of it. So VCat is at the top of the visual subweb. So here again is that picture. Every one of these nodes shown here actually represents a web consisting of thousands of nodes. And this one shown here is the cardinal node of that subweb. That is a cardinal node for the whole web. That's the concept. So the cardinal node hypothesis, it has been considered very controversial in neuroscience, but we can see that there's overwhelming evidence for it. It follows from the hypotheses of nodal specification, nodal specificity, and hierarchy. You see, even native speakers of English sometimes have trouble. A hierarchy must have a highest level, and the node at this level must have a specific function. And it's needed for ignition of the whole web from activation of part of it. For example, when you see something, that activates the phonological representation. This property, the ability to do that, requires that there be cardinal nodes. Anyway, additional evidence, it's automatically recruited in the learning hypothesis. So when the cardinal node is activated, it activates the entire functional web. I'm going to skip over that. Now, linguistic and conceptual structure. This extrapolation can be extended to linguistic and conceptual structures. Local uniformity of cortical structure. I'll move on. Now, so likewise, conceptual systems, experimental findings on the systems in monkeys can be applied to an understanding of that in human beings. So, a cognitive network is a person's map of the entire cosmos. This is in a very literal sense. We know that there is a map of the body. That's an established fact from the studies that have been done on other mammals. And we have also a conceptual map of the cosmos. This is a consequence of the learning process. It automatically follows from nodal specificity and nodal adjacency. Now, basic operations in the cortex. Columns, of course, do not store symbols. This is what they do. They receive activation, they maintain activation, they inhibit competitors, and they transmit activation. That's all they do. So we have linguistic information is represented in the cortex without use of any symbols. It's all in the connectivity. So we have these two basic functions of cortical columns. Integration, a column is activated if it receives enough activation from other columns. The thalamus also enters in. We don't need to go into those details. And it can be activated to varying degrees. Stronger activation leads to stronger response. And it can keep the activation alive for a period of time. And the other major operation is broadcasting. An activated column transmits activation to other columns. It can be either excitatory or inhibitory. So it inhibits competitors. So for example, when a voiceless stop phoneme is activated, it not only activates, but it inhibits the activation of competitors, like voiced stops or stops in other positions. Learning is the adjustment of connection strengths and thresholds. So this is how it works. Broadcasting, when you get activated, like that. Oh, I got activated. Now I'll tell my friends. That's it. That's the basic operation of the brain. So processing is parallel and serial. It's hierarchical. It's bidirectional. I haven't talked about that, but it is. And it is variable. You get varying strengths of connections, varying degrees of activation, variation over time because of learning. And the brain is very flexible. We call that plasticity. Locally, all cognitive information is represented as nodes and their interconnections. All processing consists of broadcasting and interconnection. So complexity, what the brain can do, very complex, but it's built from simplicity because every node is a simple processor. And it just these things. So how can such simplicity produce such complexity? The answer is numbers. There's a huge quantity of nodes and interconnections. You have parallel distributed processing, hierarchical organization. The result is we have these marvelous things called brains with all of their power. Now, there's a little bit more I can say about learning. This is what we've seen so far. It requires that links, it requires that we have latent links, abundance of latent links, and abundance of latent nodes. That's the abundance hypothesis. We've seen it, the acorns falling from an oak tree, many, many thousands, of which only a few, if any, will result in the next generation of oaks. So we have silent synapses. Learning is bottom up. This is review. And it's a Darwinian process, works by trial and error. Thousands of possibilities are available. You strengthen only those few that succeed. Edelman calls this neural Darwinism, a very good term. Now, columns of different sizes. There are, besides the mini column, which I've talked about, that's the smallest unit. Sometimes you get functional columns of larger size, up to the maxi column or even the hyper column, consisting of contiguous columns. Nodal specificity applies for the larger columns as well as for the mini columns. Also, the adjacency hypothesis applies. So this allows you to have categories and subcategories. The whole category may be represented by a larger column, with the subcategories represented in many columns within that larger column. That gives you the concept of the functional column, intermediate in size. Different functional columns are distinct because of non-shared additional features. Mountcastle puts it this way: the neurons of a maxi column have certain sets of static and dynamic properties in common, upon which others that may differ are superimposed. So the result is that maxi columns in the hypercolumn sharing certain basic features while differing with respect to others. And they can be further subdivided on the basis of additional features. The result is that columnar structure directly maps categories and subcategories. Here's an example. This was this experiment done with a macaque monkey. Here you see varieties of shading. This is a super category, we could call that, category with a, and here are three subcategories. So, for example, you have a child learning, sees his first bear, father tells him, well, that's a bear. And so you activate a whole column. Later on, you can subdivide that for different kinds of bear. So at early stage, a whole column gets recruited. Later, you get further distinctions. Okay. So I'm going to show you here. Here's the case where this activation, it was a column, but it's actually a large column consisting of subcolumns. And then you can further distinguish parts of it by activation from other places. This, so to review, all the information is in the connectivity. It is distributed, and yet every node has a specific local function. Low-level information is in dedicated locations. High-level information is located in accordance with the experience of the person. So we have nodal specificity, nodal adjacency, and the consequence of all this is that every person has a cognitive network, which is a map of one's world. You can call it the personal mental cosmos. That's it. Thanks. Here's some references. This one's available online. That's it, folks. Now, I'm going to escape from here so I can see you. Let's see if I can do that. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Lamb. You have that button, oprește prezentarea. You can hit that button.
Let's see, what can
Yeah. So the blue button on your screen that says oprește prezentarea, it would be to stop the presenting.
Let's
so that
see.
you can see us.
How can my screen shows still, I want to get back my view of everybody.
Can you see it? Yeah, that button on the, yeah.
Perfect.
Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay, good.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for
I wasn't
this
able to see you all during my
presentation,
presentation.
Yeah.
So I'm ready to take your questions if you have any.
All right. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear.
Thanks again, Professor Lamb, for this presentation. And if anyone in the audience has a question, Alina, maybe you can help me with organizing this. I'm not used to, I see people raising hands. So maybe we can have
yes, there is someone.
an order.
There is someone, Daniel Stancu, and then Horea Haitonic afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the model. How would it look for theoretical concepts, like the nodes and all?
Sorry,
I
didn't get that.
How would the nodes model that we saw with the concepts like for the motor, for the fork and stuff, would look for a theoretical, I don't know, anything actually, like the one that doesn't have a representation actually in the real world, an abstract concept?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So if I may, can you hear me, Professor Lamb?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the question was like this: how would the model look for abstract concepts? The model based on nodes, cardinal nodes.
Abstract concepts. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, abstract concepts, yeah, they are built on simple concepts. Many layers of hierarchical structure, but every abstract concept can ultimately be reduced to simpler concepts. And sometimes they're not well defined, but they're based on the experience that the individual has had with that concept. It varies from one individual to another, not only from one language to another, but even within speakers of the same language. I mean, one person's representation of some abstract concept is usually not the same as those of other people. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it did actually answer my question. Thanks a lot.
Good.
Then Horea Haitonic.
Hi.
thank you first for the presentation. I just want to say I come from probably a different background, so I'm not a linguist or anything. I actually work in technology, in IT,
Oh, yes.
and this was very interesting for me because when you work in IT, I mean, during the last year, you are constantly exposed to hype and news regarding these neural networks that
Yes.
seem to be progressing quite quick and in an impressive pace,
Yes.
let's say. And I'm just curious because to me, they look awfully similar, right? This is basically what these engineers are trying to do, to have a simplified version. So they took some engineering shortcuts because this is how
Yes.
engineers are.
Yes.
Because the actual brain is way too complex. So
Yes.
okay, let's make something simpler and smaller and see if we can a little bit replicate some things that happen in the brain. And I think they are doing it on a very, of course, restricted and limited scale, but there's learning and there's feedback and there's specialty areas in the network that start to become obvious and so on. And I think they are mostly applying it, as you probably know, on language, natural language interpretation and generation now, and I
Yes.
think they are actually quite successful. And
Yes.
I see a similar problem raising, like maybe neuroscience is trying to answer. People are now trying to understand how does it work, because just like the brain, you
Yes.
have a network of many simple nodes, and somewhere in the connections there's a huge amount of information and concepts being built and so on, and they now try to probably analyze this also for the artificial networks, like these neural networks, these robot brains,
Yes.
if we can say so. And I think, I mean, my question is, do you think this will be maybe a job in the future, or a scientific domain to be a neuroscientist for the robot brains?
Yes, I think so. But most of these artificial neural nets that they are working with nowadays are missing some things that we really know about brain structure. They're
Absolutely.
using, and actually the computer is basically uh, quite different in its hardware from the brain, and
Yes.
so. But they have done amazing things anyway. I
I-
my
I-
prediction would be that in the future, people will be learning more and more about the brain, and they will apply that knowledge to their
yeah.
work with artificial neural structures, and that it will be a very rich uh, research area with great opportunities for careers. And they will be doing amazing things. They're already doing amazing things.
Yeah, and there are lots of similarities, right? As you say, there are also differences, and their model is way simpler than neurons and so on. But I
Yes,
think we will find that there are regions and concepts building up somehow. Nobody knows exactly how and where, but yeah,
yes,
it's probably going to take similar methods that you are applying to maybe understand better how those networks work. Actually.
yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
You
It
bet.
was it was really interesting for me.
Yeah. Anything else? I see
Professor
Gisela there. How are you,
Anca
Gisela?
Veliko. You need to unmute your mic, please.
I hoped you did.
Oh, is my mute in my
So,
mic is
no,
No, that's fine.
mine was
oh,
muted. So
okay.
I want to thank you for this lovely presentation. My English is quite approximative. I want to ask you a question from the book, not from the presentation, if
Yes.
possible, about the actual nodes architecture, the OR node, the threshold one, the low threshold node for
Oh,
OR
yes.
relationship. I think this is the most interesting one, but also the more difficult to formalize, because you need plenty of adjacent inhibition. and you need some clock or something,
Yes.
so that only one connection succeed at each time, because otherwise it transforms to an end node. I mean, the architecture of the OR node, if you could say something about it.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that.
Okay, no problem.
Well, if I may, I could try to rephrase this.
Yes.
So I think what Anka is asking is, how exactly is the OR node in your abstract notation?
Oh, I see.
How is it working?
Oh, yeah, the or and the and. Well, this is, yeah, that's the or and and node are at a high level of abstraction in network structure. Here I was talking about the network as it relates to the actual cortical columns, but those nodes of that network are in what I call the narrow notation, and the abstract notation is a very abstracted version from that. That's where we have the and the or nodes. Now, in the actual cortical network, what we have is thresholds, and the thresholds are they are very complex. They can be of varying levels and variable strength, so that a threshold can be either weakly satisfied or strongly satisfied. Moreover, the thresholds can vary from one time to another depending on experience. And so, a weakly activated threshold allows the node to send out more activation. Sorry, a weakly activated threshold sends out less activation. A strongly activated one sends out more activation. So the and the or are special cases that work at a very abstract level of understanding. When unfortunately, it's all very complex. The level, at which I was talking about brain structure, is several steps removed in abstraction from actual language. Unfortunately, people have tried to use these relational networks to do actual language description, and it's very difficult because of the different levels of abstraction involved. But anyway, this is one example of that. I guess that wasn't very helpful.
Thank you.
So if I may, following up on that question, and then we'll go on with other people's question. Professor Lamb, do you think that this is let's say, a problem, or is this an area where people should look into more? I mean, this gap between the higher abstract level, where you could actually describe linguistic phenomena in more or less traditional terms, and this level of fine-grained details that you were talking about. And I feel like, as you said, there are several levels
Yes.
Between
There
these two. So let's say, how could linguists interested in this kind of approach could deal with this gap?
Yes, this is a real problem. I wrote a paper on this subject a few years ago in relation to systemic functional linguistics. This is the theory of Halliday. He also uses networks in his description, but his networks are at a more abstract level. And being at a more abstract level, they are actually better suited to doing actual linguistic description. And so you have to think, unfortunately, the world is complex. So you have to think in terms of levels of abstraction. And at the level that's close to brain structure, you have the kind of thing that I was talking about today. But to be closer to to be able to describe languages, you have to use a much more abstract structure like that of Halliday's systemic networks. They have been described in numerous books by Halliday and others. And then you, at an even more abstract level, you actually use symbols because the human eye works so easily with symbols. To do an actual linguistic description in relational networks is both difficult, and it's difficult for a reader to read. It's much easier. We're so accustomed to using symbols that if you're doing practical language description, it's easier to just use symbols. Even Halliday's people do that. Halliday says it's a network, but in all of their descriptions, including Halliday's own descriptions, he uses symbols. That's what we have to do, but it helps to know ultimately that they don't represent the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is a network.
Okay, thank you. And I think there were some other questions, at least one I think I saw. I don't remember who.
Yes, Octavia Zlobiu had a question beforehand.
Okay, and then
Yes.
John.
Okay, and then Juan Linas.
First, thank you, Professor Lem, for such an insightful presentation. It's wonderful. I have two short questions. My first question is, do we use the model? Do we apply the model to, like, do we construct the network for memories and persons, like the way we construct the model in our heads for the concept fork, as you presented? And my example would be, let's imagine that I met Joanne 2 years ago. And when I think of Joanne and I remember her, do I again activate different parts from my brain when I think of Joanne, like her smell, the way she talks, the experiences we had together? So would I be, would it be too much to equal Joanne as a concept in my head? That would be my first question.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes.
Okay, great.
And so when you think about her, you reactivate those same connections that were built earlier. And so in the same way, if you're watching a sporting event on television, if you have actually participated in that sport yourself, you activate some of those same connections as you watch the game. So people who have played soccer, for example, football, when they watch a football match, their brain activity is quite different from that of people who have not played football, because they are reactivating those same nodes. So whenever you recall anything, any person, any event, you are actually reactivating some of the nodes that were activated during the original occurrence.
And this is somehow linked to my second question, because they are interlinked anyway. Learning and unlearning, what happens to the thresholds that I no longer use? Do I recycle them, or do I lose them?
Well, you don't know. I don't think you recycle them. They remain there. They gradually weaken with disuse. If you don't use something for a long period of time, it will gradually weaken. But it can be revived if you go back to thinking that. Same thing happens with your knowledge of another language. If you don't use a language for many years.
Exactly, yeah.
But then it will come back much more easily than if you had never known the language, if you start using it again.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. I'm very impressed with everyone's knowledge of English.
Well, being
it's easy for me.
Let's say, Romanian not being, let's say, an international language, we have to activate our nodes of English quite often.
Yes. Yes.
So I think Joan had a question as well.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Sidney. My English is the worst. So, and you just answered by Mrs. Globut. So the question, because I'm a bilingual, a social bilingual. So while the time I was learning, let's say, Spanish, I was losing my Catalan at the same time. That means I was losing structures in Catalan to acquire the words and structure in Spanish. And I would like to know about if that can happen simultaneously in your model, to some nodes getting activated while deactivating another nodes. And then also, if as a Catalan speaker, I'm in Romania, but now just answer that question. Yes, sometimes I wanted to ask you if what happens, why I when I speak Catalan, sometimes it comes a word in Romanian and not in Catalan. And that, of course, that you just answered that it just the connection got weakened by the time expended in Romania. So, thank you.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understood all of that, but connections become weaker over time if they are not used. I talked about how connections get strengthened if they are successfully used. The other thing I did not talk about is that if a connection is not used for a very long period of time, it gradually weakens. It never disappears altogether, but it gradually gets weaker and weaker. It can be revived by being used again. But so that's what happens. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think we have Gisela with a question.
Oh, your mic is not on.
Yes, Gisela, you have to.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation, and thank you, Sydney. It's a great pleasure to see you again. Well,
Likewise.
thank you for this wonderful talk. And I have a question from your book also. Have you resolved this problem of how to connect the connection of participants with those of processes? Do you remember that subject in your book, Pathways of the Brain? You say that that this problem remain unsolved. How to connect the connections of participants in a network with those of processes, or to those of processes. I don't know if I am clear with the question, but you say that when you do you remember? You don't. Okay.
I'm not sure I understand. I don't think
When you build those networks of procedures,
procedures. Yes.
you have participants and
Yes.
processes, and you
Oh, yes.
you say that it was a problem to connect
The
both.
participants in the process. Yes. Yes, it's a very difficult problem. I've thought about it a lot. Well, what I can say is that of course, everything is represented in the cortex, and syntax, as it turns out, is driven by semantics. People have tried to do syntax more or less independently of semantics, and that does not lead to an understanding of how syntax works. So the participants in processes, the participants are always, they're both thought of and spoken of, as well. First, let me do a little localization. All, in the first place, all things, or all people, all animals and everything, are represented in the system in the temporal lobe of the brain. And all processes are represented in the frontal lobe. And when you construct a thought, whether you articulated it in language or not, then it's involving an interaction between the frontal and temporal lobes. So the processes are in the frontal lobe and the participants are in the temporal lobe. So you say, let's say my son is going to school. My son is represented as a node in that area of the temporal lobe where people are represented. And he is a specific person represented there by his specific node with all of its associated network. And if you're thinking specifically at this moment about the son going to school, then that process is represented in the frontal lobe, and a connection is built at that moment between that participant and that process. And when you speak about it, then you have to, we call it syntax that gets involved, but it's that's just the way of representing that thought. The thought, I'm afraid I'm not making this very clear, but the thought is a sort of temporary network built up with those connections. And it's not only temporary, it remains there. And by the way, every time, I didn't say this, I guess, but we should make this explicit. Every time you use any part of a network, that part of the network which you have been using changes a little bit because of the adjustments in connection strengths and also adjustments in thresholds. And so in this way, you remember the thoughts that you have had, unless you review them, in which case they fade away. Now, to understand all of this, you also have to bring in the hippocampus and a structure deep within the cortex, which keeps track of locations in space and time. And so your model of the world includes also space and time, everything related to each other.
Thank you.
Complex.
Thank you. Thank you. And another question, very, very short. You said the column is the fundamental module of a perceptual system. Also, the column is the fundamental module of everything. I understand of everything, not only of the perceptual system. Okay?
The column?
Okay. The column is the fundamental module
right.
of everything.
Yes, it's the column. It would be a mistake to think of the neural network, the cognitive network, as made up of neurons. You have to think of it as made up of columns. The column is the fundamental structural unit.
Okay.
So the column is made of neurons, but the column is the functional unit of the network. So every node in a network is represented as a column.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Gisela. Any other questions? Well, if not, I have one last question.
Yes.
Linking maybe to some more traditional topics in linguistics. I was just thinking about this when you presented. Of course, I like to think I'm somehow familiar with your theory, but as you were presenting and as you were talking about the way learning occurs in a relational network, You talked about right nodes sending out information to many to many other nodes, and then successfully activating one or maybe few nodes.
Yes.
That's the basics of, and then making those connections stronger. That's the basics of Hebbian learning. Now,
Yes.
is the fact that learning is basically a Hebbian process? Is this a possible, I'd say, argument in favor of constituency rather than dependency as a basic principle in linguistics or in language? Because we've been talking about constituency versus dependency.
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't thought about that enough to be able to give you a good answer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the node that is being activated will represent certain information, but is activated by some lower level node that would represent features of that, right? So that would mean that the higher level information consists of A plus B. So that would be, in my view, a sort of constituency principle, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that both constituency and dependency have a certain validity to them. But either one cannot be understood in its own terms. I think to understand what's really going on, you have to look at it in terms of what's going on in the network.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes very close to a constituency way of doing it. But I don't know. I like certain features of dependency also. And that's all I can say.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So if there are no other questions, I think we could wrap it up here. Thank you again, Professor Lam, for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Next time you'll come in person, right?
Well, I hope so.
Great.
Yes. After you take care of that Russian threat.
Yeah. We'll try to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.